Hey guys, have you ever imagined yourself as a Viking, sailing the seas with wind in your hair and adventure on the horizon? Well, before you start daydreaming, consider this. Your hair would be stiff with dried sweat and fish guts. You'd be sharing your bed with more fleas than a stray dog, and your morning routine would involve scraping ice off your beard just to take a sip of water that tastes like it's been sitting in a dirty barrel for 3 weeks. The glamorous life of a Viking wasn't quite what the films make it out to be. Your hands would be covered in blisters from rowing, your boots would constantly have holes in them, and the closest thing to a shower would be jumping into a freezing river once a month if you were lucky. If you're enjoying this glimpse into the past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical reality checks. I'm genuinely curious to know where you're watching from, so tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. So let's step into the soggy, itchy and surprisingly smelly world of a Viking and find out exactly why you wouldn't last a single week. Your day as a Viking would start before dawn, and not because you set an alarm or had a nice gentle wake-up routine. No, you'd be jolted awake by the cold seeping through every layer of wool and fur you're wrapped in, because your longhouse might have thick walls, but it's still basically a large wooden tent with a hole in the roof for smoke. That hole, by the way, doesn't just let smoke out, it lets rain in, snow in, and the occasional bird dropping that lands uncomfortably close to your face. You'd wake up with your joints aching from sleeping on a wooden platform covered with straw that's been compressed into something resembling cardboard. The straw would be home to an entire ecosystem of fleas, lice, and other tiny creatures that spent the night treating your body like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The first thing you'd notice, even before you open your eyes properly, is the smell. Imagine a gym changing room that hasn't been cleaned in 6 months, mixed with a fish market on a hot day, combined with wet dog and smoke. That's your home. Everyone in the longhouse, and we're talking about 20 to 30 people all living in one big room, has been sleeping in the same clothes they worked in yesterday. There's no such thing as pajamas. You sleep in your day clothes, and those clothes don't get washed very often, because washing means hauling water, heating it over a fire, and scrubbing things by hand with soap made from animal fat and ash. Most people can't be bothered more than once every few weeks. Getting up means stepping onto a floor that's part packed earth, part old rushes, and part things you'd rather not identify in the dim light. Your feet would land in something cold and slightly damp. Maybe it's just condensation. Maybe it's where someone missed the chamber pot in the night. You'd learn not to ask questions and just wipe your feet on a cleaner bit of floor. The chamber pot, speaking of which, would be sitting in the corner, and it wouldn't be emptied until someone decides it's their turn to brave the cold outside. Until then, it contributes its own special notes to the general aroma of the longhouse. Breakfast isn't a leisurely affair with toast and a hot drink. You'd be lucky to get some leftover porridge from last night, reheated over the fire until it's got a skin on top that you have to poke through. The porridge would be made from barley or oats, cooked with water, and if you're fortunate, there might be a tiny bit of butter or some dried fish mixed in. The dried fish, by the way, would be so hard you'd need to gnaw at it like a dog with a bone. It wouldn't taste bad exactly, just incredibly salty and chewy, with a texture like leather. Your jaw would ache after a few minutes of trying to break it down enough to swallow. The fire in the middle of the longhouse would be the only source of heat and light, and it would be smoking terribly because damp wood was added during the night. Your eyes would be watering before you'd even finished your porridge. Everyone would be coughing and rubbing their eyes, but this is just normal. You'd shuffle closer to the fire to warm up, but not too close because someone's drying their socks on the stones around the edge, and the smell of scorched wool and foot sweat would be strong enough to make you gag. These socks, by the way, would be more whole than sock, and they'd still be damp because nothing truly dries in a longhouse during winter. Once you've choked down your breakfast and blinked away enough smoke tears to see properly, it's time to get to work. If you're a man, your job might be farming, fishing, boat building or raiding, depending on the season. If you're a woman, you'd be running the household, which sounds simple until you realize it means literally everything that keeps people alive. Cooking, brewing, weaving, sewing, preserving food, making cheese, tending animals, and keeping the place from descending into complete chaos. Both roles are exhausting in ways that would make a modern workout routine look like a gentle stroll. Let's say you're heading out to work on a fishing boat. First, you'd need to wrap yourself in layers of wool and possibly a cloak made of thick, oily wool that repels water somewhat. The key word is somewhat. You'd still get wet, just slightly less quickly. Your clothes would already feel heavy before you even step outside. The wool would be scratchy against your skin, and if you've got any kind of rash or irritation from the fleas, the constant rubbing would make it worse throughout the day. You try to ignore the itching on your back, right between your shoulder blades where you can't quite reach. Stepping outside, you'd be hit by a wall of cold air that makes your lungs hurt. The village would be a collection of longhouses, animal sheds and workshops, all surrounded by mud. So much mud. Mud mixed with animal droppings from the sheep, goats, pigs and chickens that wander freely around the settlement. You'd quickly learn to watch where you step, but you'd still manage to plant your foot in something unpleasant at least once a day. Your boots, made of leather and bound with strips of cloth, would squelch with every step. They'd let water in within minutes of walking through the wet grass, and once your feet are wet, they'd stay wet all day. The walk to the shore would take you past the animal pens, where the pigs would be snorting and rooting through their own filth with enthusiasm. Pigs in the Viking age weren't the pink, relatively clean animals you might see on a modern farm. These would be hairy, muddy, and surprisingly aggressive if you got too close at feeding time. The smell from the pen would be thick and earthy, a combination of damp straw, manure, and pig. You'd breathe through your mouth to try to avoid the worst of it, but then you'd taste it instead, which somehow is worse. At the shore, the boat would be waiting. Viking ships are beautiful, sleek, and absolutely not designed for comfort. You'd be rowing for hours, sitting on a wooden chest that contains supplies and also serves as your seat. There's no padding. Your backside would go numb within the first hour, then start to hurt properly in the second hour, and by hour 3 you'd be shifting constantly trying to find a position that doesn't make you want to cry. The oars would be heavy, and if you're not used to this kind of work, your hands would develop blisters within the first day. Those blisters would pop, then form calluses, but only after weeks of pain. Fishing itself would be back-breaking work that makes a gym session look relaxing. You'd be hauling nets made of rough hemp that would scrape your palms raw even through the calluses. The nets would be heavy even when empty, but when full of fish, they'd require every bit of strength you have. Your back would be screaming as you bend and pull over and over. The boat would be rocking with the waves, so you'd be trying to keep your balance while also hauling on a net that seems determined to pull you overboard instead of coming up. When the catch finally comes up, you'd be dealing with fish. So many fish. Herring, mostly. Slippery and wriggling and absolutely determined to escape your grasp. They'd be everywhere, flopping on the deck, sliding under your feet, making every surface treacherous. The smell would be overwhelming, that distinctive fish odor that clings to everything. Your clothes would reek of it, your hair would smell of it, your hands would smell like fish for days no matter how much you try to wash them. The fish guts and scales would stick to your arms and chest, and you'd have bits of fish slime in places you didn't know fish slime could reach. Gutting the catch would be your next job, and it's exactly as pleasant as it sounds. You'd slice open fish after fish, scraping out the insides and tossing them overboard, where seagulls would be screaming and diving for the scraps. The birds would be bold, sometimes landing on the boat itself and trying to steal fish right out of your hands. They'd be shrieking constantly, a piercing noise that would drill into your skull and stay there even after you're back on land. Your knife would get slippery, and you'd have to grip it carefully to avoid it sliding out of your hand and either going overboard or into your leg. By the time you head back to shore, you'd be soaked through despite your oily wool cloak. The water would have found every gap in your clothing, and now you'd be sitting in a puddle of cold seawater mixed with fish residue. The rowing back would be even harder because you're tired, your muscles are burning, and the wind always seems to be against you on the return journey. Your shoulders would feel like they're on fire, and your lower back would be one solid knot of pain. Getting back to the village would be a relief, except now comes the job of dealing with all those fish. They'd need to be preserved because you can't just stick them in a freezer. Smoking and salting are your only options. The smoking shed would be another building filled with eye-watering smoke, worse than the longhouse because fish smoke has a special intensity that makes regular wood smoke seem pleasant. You'd be hanging fish on racks in the thick haze, barely able to see what you're doing, coughing and spluttering the whole time. The heat in the shed combined with your already damp clothes would make you feel like you're being steamed alive. Salting fish means covering them in salt and packing them in barrels. Your hands would be raw and stinging from the salt, getting into every tiny cut and scratch. The salt would dry your skin until it cracks, and those cracks would sting even more when you get more salt in them. It's a vicious cycle. You'd try to be careful, but after the 100th fish, your attention would slip, and you'd inevitably rub your eye with a salty hand. The burning would make you hop around, swearing in Old Norse while your companions laugh at you, because they have all done the same thing and misery loves company. If you're working on land instead of at sea, your day wouldn't be any easier. Farming in the Viking Age means manual labour that would make modern farming look like pressing buttons on a computer. Let's say it's harvest time. You'd be out in the fields from dawn until you can barely see, cutting grain with a sickle. A sickle is a curved blade on a short handle, which means you'd be bent over all day long. Your back would be in agony after the first hour, but you'd have 10 more hours to go. The repetitive motion of cutting and gathering would make your arms burn and your hands cramp around the handle. The grain would be dusty and full of insects. Grasshoppers would be jumping everywhere, occasionally landing on your face or down your tunic. The dust would coat your throat and nose, making you cough and sneeze constantly. You'd have bits of chaff stuck to your sweaty face and neck, itching and prickling. By midday, you'd be desperately thirsty, and the water you brought in a leather flask would be warm and taste like the flask itself, a musty leather flavour that's not quite refreshing but better than nothing. Lunch would be a brief pause where you'd sit in the field and eat more of that dried fish, along with some hard bread that's only slightly softer than the leather of your boots. You'd need to dunk the bread in water to even bite through it, and even then it would be a workout for your jaws. There might be some cheese if you're lucky, made from sheep or goat milk, and aged until it's hard and sharp. It would be good cheese actually, but the quantity would be small because it needs to last through the winter. After lunch it's back to cutting grain until your hands are blistered and your back feels like it might never straighten again. The sun would be beating down if it's a good day, which sounds nice until you remember you're wearing multiple layers of wool and there's no sunscreen. Your face would turn red and sore, and the back of your neck would burn because your hair is tied back under a headcloth to keep the chaff out. If it's raining, which is more likely, you'd just be wet and cold and miserable while still doing the same back-breaking work. Once the grain is cut, it needs to be gathered into bundles, loaded onto a cart, and taken back to the village. The cart would be pulled by an ox, a huge animal that moves at its own pace, regardless of how much you yell at it or prod it with a stick. Oxen are strong but not fast, and not particularly bright. Yours would likely stop to chew grass at the most inconvenient moments, or decide it doesn't want to go through that puddle and take a detour through an even bigger puddle instead. Back at the village, the grain needs to be threshed to separate the seeds from the stalks. This means beating the grain with a wooden flail, swinging it over and over and over. It's another full-body workout that doesn't end. The threshing floor would be dusty beyond belief, and you'd be breathing in grain dust with every breath. By the end of the day, you'd cough up things you'd rather not examine too closely. Your nose would be caked with dust both inside and out, and no amount of sniffing and blowing would clear it completely. Evening would finally arrive, and you drag yourself back to the longhouse feeling like you've been trampled by a herd of those oxen. Every muscle would ache, your hands would be throbbing, and you'd be looking forward to sitting down and resting. Except there's no rest yet because dinner needs to be prepared. And if you're a woman in the household, this is your domain regardless of what else you've been doing all day. If you're a man, you'd still be expected to help with various tasks or tend to the animals before you can even think about relaxing. Cooking in the Viking Age means tending that smoky fire in the middle of the longhouse. You'd be adding wood, stirring pots, turning meat on a spit if there is any, and trying not to burn yourself on hot metal or stone. The cooking pot would be an iron cauldron hanging over the fire, and getting anything out of it means leaning over the flames and risking singed eyebrows. The heat on your face would be intense while your back is cold from the draft, creating an uncomfortable contrast that means you're never quite the right temperature. Dinner might be a stew made from whatever vegetables are available: turnips, cabbage, onions, maybe some peas. These would be cooked until they're soft and mushy, flavoured with salt and herbs if you're lucky, and maybe a bit of meat if someone was successful hunting, or if it's time to slaughter one of the animals. The meat would be tough and fatty, requiring serious chewing, but it would be a welcome change from fish and porridge. You'd fish chunks out of the communal pot with your fingers, or a piece of bread, burning your fingertips in the process, but too hungry to wait for it to cool. The bread, when fresh, would actually be pretty good. Dense and hearty, made from rye or barley, baked on hot stones by the fire. But bread doesn't stay fresh long, and most of the time you'd be eating bread that's a day or 3 old, which means it's hard enough to use as a weapon. You'd be gnawing at it throughout the meal, gradually working your way through a chunk that seems to get bigger rather than smaller as you chew. Eating would be a communal affair with everyone gathered around, sitting on benches or the sleeping platforms. The noise would be considerable, people talking, laughing, arguing, dogs barking and begging for scraps, and the constant crackle of the fire. Those dogs, by the way, would be underfoot constantly, hoping for dropped food, and occasionally succeeding when someone's too tired to hold on properly. The dogs would be thin and scrappy, more working animals than pets, and they'd snap at each other over the smallest scrap of food. After dinner, if you have any energy left, there might be some socializing. Stories would be told, news shared, maybe someone would play a simple instrument or sing. This is actually one of the better parts of Viking life, the community aspect of everyone living together. But you'd be struggling to keep your eyes open, fighting the exhaustion that's pulling at every part of your body. The longhouse would be warming up with all the body heat and the fire, making it stuffy and close. The smell of all those people, the day's work still on everyone's clothes, would be thick in the air. When you finally get to lie down on your sleeping platform, you'd be so tired you might not even care about the lumpy straw or the fleas. You'd wrap yourself in your cloak, maybe a woolen blanket if you have one, and try to get comfortable on wood that seems specifically designed to hit every pressure point. The person next to you would be close enough that you're touching, because space is limited and body heat is valuable in winter. You'd hear them breathing, snoring, shifting around, and you'd be doing the same, contributing to the nighttime symphony of human sounds. The fire would be damped down for the night, but not extinguished, because starting a fire from scratch in the morning is too much work. The dim glow would cast strange shadows on the walls, and you'd watch them dance while trying to convince your body to relax. Your feet would be cold despite being wrapped up, because they got wet this morning and never really dried. Your shoulders would be tight and sore, and you'd try to find a position where they don't hurt, failing repeatedly. Just as you're finally drifting off, someone would get up to use the chamber pot, stumbling in the dark and probably stepping on someone else's foot in the process. There'd be muffled cursing, a dog would bark, and you'd be jolted back to wakefulness. This would happen several times a night, because when you're living with 30 people, someone always needs to get up for something. Light sleepers would not have a good time in the Viking Age. Let's talk about personal hygiene, or the relative lack of it. Vikings actually were cleaner than many of their contemporaries, but clean is a relative term. You might bathe once a week, which sounds reasonable until you realize it means boiling water over that fire, pouring it into a wooden tub, and sitting in water that's shared with several other people. By the time it's your turn, the water would be lukewarm and murky, with a film of scum on top from previous bathers. You'd still get in because it's better than nothing, and at least you'd get the worst of the grime off. Soap would be homemade from animal fat and wood ash, forming a harsh alkali mixture that cleans effectively, but leaves your skin feeling stripped and tight. It would sting any cuts or scratches, and if you get it in your eyes, you'd be blinded with pain for several minutes. Your hair would be washed in the same water, and afterwards it would feel like straw until you work some oil through it to make it manageable again. That oil might be butter or animal fat, which smells exactly like you'd expect. Combing your hair would be a daily trial because even with regular washing, lice would be a constant companion. You'd have a fine-toothed comb made of bone or wood, and you'd work through your hair section by section, crushing lice between your thumbnails when you found them. The crunching sound would be audible and deeply unpleasant, but also satisfying in a gross way because each one you kill is one less bite on your scalp. You'd never get them all, and by tomorrow there'd be more, but you'd keep trying anyway. Teeth cleaning would be done with a frayed twig or a piece of rough cloth, rubbing your teeth and gums to remove the worst of the food debris. There'd be no mint freshness, no fluoride protection, just mechanical scrubbing and hope. Your gums would be sore from the rough treatment, and your teeth would gradually wear down from all the grit in the food. Stone dust from the quern used to grind grain, sand from the beach, general dirt from vegetables that couldn't be washed perfectly clean. Clothes would be changed when they literally couldn't be worn anymore because they were too stiff with dirt or falling apart. Laundry day would be a major production involving hauling water, heating it, soaking the clothes with that harsh soap, pounding them on rocks or in a wooden trough, and then rinsing them multiple times. The whole process would take hours and leave your hands red and sore. In winter, drying clothes would be nearly impossible, so you'd end up wearing things that are still slightly damp and hoping your body heat would finish the job. Let's talk about winter, because if you think Viking life is hard in summer, winter would make you genuinely question your will to live. The days would be short, brutally short, depending on how far north you are. You'd get maybe 6 hours of dim daylight, and the rest would be darkness and cold that seeps into your bones. The longhouse would become your prison, because going outside for any length of time could be genuinely dangerous. The cold would be relentless. We're not talking about the kind of cold where you turn up the heating and put on a jumper. This would be cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe, that numbs your fingers and toes in minutes, that makes your nose run constantly, and then freezes the moisture on your face. Your breath would turn to ice crystals in your beard or on your headcloth, creating a white frost that wouldn't melt until you got back inside. Inside wouldn't be much better. Yes, there's a fire, but it's in the middle of a large room and you're probably not sitting right next to it. Heat rises and escapes through that hole in the roof, and cold drafts would creep in through every gap in the walls. You'd be huddled in every piece of clothing you own, wrapped in furs and blankets, and still shivering. Your feet would be perpetually cold because heat doesn't reach floor level, and no amount of wool socks would fully solve the problem. Frost would form on the inside walls of the longhouse overnight, creating pretty patterns that would be more appreciated if they weren't in your bedroom. In the morning, you'd see your breath indoors, and the water in the bucket would have a layer of ice on top that you'd need to break through to get a drink. That first sip of icy water would make your teeth ache, but at least it would be fresh. By afternoon, the water would have picked up the flavour of the longhouse atmosphere, tasting of smoke and mustiness. Food in winter would be monotonous to the point of despair. You'd be eating from preserved stores, dried fish, dried meat, root vegetables from the storage pit, fermented foods, and endless porridge made from last year's grain. Fresh food would be a distant memory. The dried fish would be even tougher than usual, because the cold makes everything harder and more brittle. You'd be chewing and chewing, working moisture into it from your own mouth until finally it's soft enough to swallow. The root vegetables from the storage pit would be sprouting and a bit wrinkled, nowhere near as good as fresh ones, but they'd still be edible. You'd be eating a lot of turnips, which get old very quickly when it's turnip stew for the 5th day in a row. The fermented foods would include things like sauerkraut, which is actually quite good for you and prevents scurvy. But the smell of the fermentation crock when you open it would be sharp enough to make your eyes water. Going outside to tend the animals would be a necessary torture. The animals need feeding and checking on, regardless of the weather. You'd bundle up in everything you own, wrapping cloth around your face to protect it from the wind, and venture out into the freezing morning. The animals would be huddled together in their shed, which would be warmer than outside thanks to their body heat, but also incredibly pungent. The concentration of animal smell in an enclosed space with poor ventilation would be something you'd need to steel yourself for every single time. The chickens, if they haven't stopped laying entirely from the cold, would need their eggs collected. Your fingers would be too numb to feel properly, so you'd be fumbling around in the nesting boxes, touching things by accident that you'd rather not identify, trying to find eggs without breaking them. The hens would be grumpy and might peck at your hands, which you'd barely feel through the cold anyway. Any eggs you find would need to be tucked into your clothing immediately to prevent them freezing and cracking before you got back inside. The cows and goats would need milking, another job that's difficult with numb fingers. Milking requires dexterity and a gentle touch, neither of which you'd have when your hands are frozen. You'd be pressing your hands against the animal's warm flank between squirts, trying to get enough feeling back to continue. The milk would steam in the cold air, and you'd be careful not to spill any because every drop is precious when the animals are producing less in winter anyway. Water for the animals would need to be hauled from the well, assuming the well hasn't frozen over. If it has frozen, you'd need to break the ice first, smashing at it with a wooden pole until you can get through. The water bucket would be so cold it would stick to your wet hands, and carrying it back would be treacherous on ice-covered ground. You'd walk carefully, trying not to slip and waste all that effort, but you'd probably fall at least once, soaking yourself with freezing water and having to go back for more. Back inside the longhouse after morning chores, you'd need to thaw out by the fire. Your clothing would be stiff with frost and ice, and as it warmed it would start to melt, making you damp. That damp wool smell would intensify with the heat, filling your immediate area with the aroma like wet sheep. Your fingers and toes would hurt as feeling returned, a pins and needles sensation that would make you want to cry. This would happen every single day, all winter long, for months. Indoor work during winter would be the main activity. Women would be spinning thread and weaving cloth, endless hours of repetitive motion that would make your arms ache and your eyes strain in the dim light. The spinning wheel wouldn't exist yet. You'd be using a drop spindle, a stick with a weight on the end that you'd spin while drawing out fibers from a mass of wool. It requires constant attention and practice, and if you lose focus, the spindle drops and you'd have to start that section again. Weaving would be done on an upright loom with weights holding the vertical threads taut. You'd stand or sit in front of it for hours, passing the horizontal thread back and forth, beating it down with a wooden sword to pack it tight. Your back and shoulders would ache from the repeated motions, and your fingers would be sore from handling the rough wool thread. The cloth you produce would be thick and warm, but not soft. Perfect for the tunics and cloaks everyone needs, but not exactly comfortable against skin. Men would be doing indoor work too, repairing tools, making new ones, carving, working leather, fixing anything that broke during the year. Making a new axe handle would involve selecting the right piece of wood, shaping it with a knife and scraping tools, fitting it to the axe head, and binding it securely. This would take days of work, every cut and scrape done by hand, checking and rechecking the fit and balance. Your hands would be covered in small cuts from the knife slipping or the wood splitting unexpectedly. Leather work would be another winter job. You'd be making or repairing boots, belts, straps, all the leather goods that wear out from constant use. The leather would be stiff and hard to work with, requiring soaking in water to make it pliable. Your hands would be sore from pushing needles through thick leather, and you'd probably stab yourself multiple times, swearing quietly so as not to disturb the household. The leather working tools would be simple: a knife, an awl for making holes, needles made from bone, and thread made from sinew or linen. Entertainment during the long winter evenings would be vital for maintaining sanity. Stories would be told and retold, everyone knowing them by heart, but still enjoying the performance. Riddles would be exchanged, games played with dice made from bone or antler, and there'd be songs, though musical instruments would be limited. Someone might have a lyre or a simple flute, and they'd play tunes that everyone knows, with the whole household joining in the singing. Spring would eventually arrive, bringing relief and a whole new set of challenges. The ice would melt, turning everything into a boggy mess of mud that makes the summer mud look positively pleasant. The pathways between buildings would be ankle-deep in cold, sticky muck that would suck at your boots with every step. You'd try to stay on the wooden planks laid down as walkways, but they'd be slippery and inadequate, and you'd end up in the mud anyway. The animals would be let out of their winter confinement, and they'd be as eager for fresh air as you are. Unfortunately, months of being cooped up means they've been standing in their own waste all winter, and now all that accumulated mess would need to be mucked out. You'd be shoveling sodden straw and manure, load after load, carrying it to the midden heap, or spreading it on the fields as fertilizer. The smell would be overpowering, a thick barnyard reek that would cling to your clothes and hair for days. The muck would be heavy, and after the relative inactivity of winter, your muscles would protest every movement. You'd develop new blisters on top of old calluses, and your back would remind you why humans weren't designed to shovel waste all day. But it would need to be done, and there'd be no one to do it but you and your household members, all of you equally miserable and equally determined to finish the job. Spring cleaning of the longhouse would be another massive task. All the old rushes on the floor would need to be swept out, taking with them months of accumulated debris. You'd discover things you'd lost during winter, along with things you'd rather not have found. Old food scraps, bones the dogs buried, and the dried remains of various creatures that didn't survive the cold. The packed earth floor would be swept as clean as possible, then covered with fresh rushes or straw, instantly making the place smell better. Airing out bedding would be a priority on the first dry day. All those woolly blankets and fur covers would be taken outside and beaten vigorously with sticks to dislodge the dust, fleas, and general grime of winter. The dust cloud would be impressive and choking, and you'd be coughing and sneezing for hours afterwards. The bedding would be hung over the longhouse roof or on fences to air in whatever sun and wind the spring provides, and it would genuinely smell better afterwards, at least for a few days. Planting season would begin, meaning it's time to prepare the fields. The soil would need to be turned, and you'd be using a simple plough pulled by those oxen. Walking behind a plough all day, guiding it through heavy spring soil, would give you yet another kind of backache to add to your collection. The handles would be rough wood, and by the end of the day your palms would be raw despite any calluses. The oxen would be slow and stubborn as always, occasionally deciding to stop for no apparent reason, leaving you to coax them forward with a mixture of encouraging words and threats. Seeds would be sown by hand, walking up and down the field, scattering grain from a basket. It looks simple and pastoral in paintings, but the reality would be hours of repetitive motion with a heavy basket digging into your shoulder. You'd need to judge the right amount to throw with each handful, making sure the coverage is even but not too dense. Too thick and the plants will choke each other out. Too thin and you're wasting field space. It requires experience and concentration, and your arm would be burning by the time you finish even a small field. After planting comes hoping. Hoping it will rain enough but not too much. Hoping the birds don't eat all the seeds. Hoping a late frost doesn't kill the sprouts. Hoping the summer is good enough for a decent harvest. There's no weather forecast, no insurance, no backup plan beyond what you've stored. If the crop fails, people go hungry. It's that simple and that terrifying. While the crops are growing, there'd be plenty of other work to keep you occupied. Fishing would resume with enthusiasm after the winter break, and you'd be back in those boats hauling nets and getting covered in fish slime like we discussed earlier. The sea would still be cold in early spring, and falling in would be potentially fatal, so you'd be extra careful moving around on wet decks. Foraging would begin as soon as plants start growing. Early greens would be gathered eagerly, anything to add fresh flavour to the diet after months of preserved foods. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, anything edible would be picked and brought home. Nettles are nutritious, but handling them would be painful, even if you're being careful. The sting would last for hours, making your hands feel like they're on fire and covered in tiny needles. You'd learn to grip them firmly and quickly to crush the stinging hairs, but you'd still get stung regularly. Berries would come later in the year, and berry picking would be a major activity when the time comes. Everyone who can walk would be sent out to gather as many berries as possible, eating some fresh and preserving the rest. Your fingers would be stained purple or red depending on the berry, and the stains would last for days no matter how much you wash. You'd be bent over berry bushes for hours, and standing up afterwards would make you dizzy and seeing spots. The preserved berries would be turned into jam or dried for winter, providing one of the few sweet things in the Viking diet. Honey would be the only other sweetener, and it would be precious because keeping bees is difficult, and honey is worth trading for. A spoonful of berry jam would be a treat that makes the effort of picking worthwhile, spreading it on bread and savouring the sweetness. Summer would bring the warmest weather, which sounds great until you remember you're doing physical labour outdoors wearing wool. The sun would beat down, and you'd be sweating profusely, that sweat mixing with dirt and making your clothes feel like you're wearing a damp towel that's been used to clean a barn. The salt from dried sweat would create white streaks on your clothes and make your skin itch everywhere. Haymaking would be a crucial summer task. The grass would need to be cut and dried to provide winter fodder for the animals. Scything grass is skilled work that looks rhythmic and easy when done by an expert, but when you're learning, it would be exhausting and dangerous. The scythe blade would be long and sharp, and you'd need to swing it in a smooth arc while walking forward steadily. Your rhythm would be off, your back would hurt from the twisting motion, and you'd be constantly worried about cutting your own leg. Once cut, the hay would need to be spread out to dry, which means raking it into thin layers and turning it regularly so it dries evenly. If it rains before the hay is dry, you'd have to start over because wet hay would rot and be useless. You'd be watching the sky constantly, trying to judge if those clouds are going to bring rain or blow over. Getting the hay under cover just as the rain starts would be a race against time, everyone rushing to gather it up and get it into the barn. Dried hay would be itchy stuff, with bits of grass seed that work their way into your clothes and prick your skin. You'd be scratching constantly, and no amount of shaking out your clothes would get all the seeds out. They'd work their way into your undergarments, into your socks, behind your ears, finding every possible uncomfortable place to lodge themselves. The summer insects would be another constant torment. Mosquitoes and midges would swarm around you, biting any exposed skin and even managing to bite through your clothes sometimes. Your face and hands would be covered in itchy bites that you'd scratch until they're sore, then feel guilty and try not to scratch, then forget and scratch them again. The buzzing around your ears would drive you to distraction, and you'd be constantly swatting at insects with limited success. Let's talk about the social side of Viking life, because it's not all work and misery. Vikings placed huge importance on reputation, honour and community standing. Your reputation would be everything, affecting your prospects, your safety and your family's future. Building a good reputation means being seen as reliable, strong, brave, generous and skilled. Losing your reputation would be devastating, potentially turning you into an outcast with no one willing to help or trade with you. This means that social gatherings would be important events where you're constantly being judged. Feasts would happen periodically, celebrating harvests, weddings, important visitors, or just because someone has the resources and wants to show off. You'd be expected to attend, dressed in your best clothes, which would still be wool, just cleaner wool, and behave appropriately. Appropriate behaviour includes eating and drinking enthusiastically, participating in conversations, and generally being good company. The drinking at feasts would be serious business. Ale and mead would flow freely, and refusing to drink would be seen as insulting to the host. You'd be expected to keep up with the toasts, which would be frequent and become increasingly elaborate as the night goes on. The ale would be homebrewed, fairly weak but consumable in large quantities, with a yeasty flavour that you'd either get used to or learn to hide your distaste for. Mead, made from fermented honey, would be stronger and sweeter, saved for special occasions and served in a communal horn that everyone drinks from. That communal drinking horn would be passed around the hall, and you'd need to drink deeply when it reaches you, then pass it on. The horn wouldn't stand up on its own, so you couldn't put it down once you've started drinking. You'd need to finish a reasonable amount before passing it on, or risk looking weak. By the third or fourth time the horn comes around, you'd be feeling the effects, and by the 10th time you'd be genuinely drunk along with everyone else. Drunk Vikings would be loud, boisterous, and emotional. There'd be singing, arm wrestling, boasting about past deeds, and the occasional argument that threatens to turn into a fight before cooler heads intervene. You'd be participating whether you want to or not, because standing back and watching would mark you as unfriendly. You'd find yourself arm wrestling someone twice your size, losing quickly but earning respect for trying, and your arm would be sore for days afterwards from the brief contest. The food at feasts would be the best available: roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, butter, possibly even imported luxuries if the host is wealthy. You'd eat until you're stuffed, because who knows when the next feast will be, and refusing food would again insult the host. Your stomach would be uncomfortably full, stretched tight, making it hard to breathe deeply, but you'd keep picking at the food because it's there and it's good and it might be turnip stew tomorrow. Sleeping after a feast would be done right there in the host hall, everyone finding a space to lie down among the benches and tables. You'd be sleeping next to people you barely know, in a room full of drunk, snoring Vikings, with dogs wandering around looking for dropped food and occasionally stepping on people. The air would be thick with the smell of ale, sweat, roasted meat, and smoke from the fire. Your head would be spinning from the drink, and you'd probably regret several decisions by morning. Morning after a feast would be rough. You'd wake with a pounding headache, dry mouth, and the room would be stuffy and hot from all the bodies. The lingering smells of last night would be less appealing in daylight: stale ale, cold meat grease, and the general funk of too many people in one space. You'd stumble outside for fresh air and to relieve yourself, squinting against the sunlight that feels unreasonably bright, and seriously question whether the feast was worth this feeling. But it would have been worth it, because you'd have strengthened social bonds, made connections, and hopefully enhanced your reputation. Someone might have offered you work or proposed a trading arrangement, or simply remembered you as that person who tried to arm wrestle the biggest man in the room and laughed when they lost. These connections matter in a world where cooperation is essential for survival. Legal disputes would be settled at assemblies called things, where free men would gather to hear cases and make judgments. If you had a dispute with a neighbour, this is where you'd bring it. You'd need to present your case clearly, bring witnesses to support your version of events, and hope the assembly agrees with you. Public speaking wouldn't be optional. You'd need to stand up in front of everyone and argue your case, which would be terrifying if you're not naturally confident. The judgments could include fines, compensation payments, or in serious cases, outlawry. Being outlawed would mean you're expelled from society with no protection under the law. Anyone could harm you without consequence, and you'd need to leave the area or risk being killed. It's a harsh system, but it generally works because the threat of outlawry keeps most people from committing serious offences. Feuds between families would be a constant worry. If someone from another family wrongs you or your kin, you'd be expected to seek compensation or revenge. This could escalate quickly, with back-and-forth retaliation that lasts for generations. You might find yourself honor-bound to avenge a relative you barely knew, risking your own life because family honor demands it. The stress of an active feud would be immense, knowing that violence could erupt at any moment. Raiding would be the other major aspect of Viking life that we haven't fully covered yet. The image of Vikings sailing off to raid distant lands is famous, but the reality would be less glorious than the legends suggest. Yes, there'd be adventure and the possibility of wealth, but there'd also be terrible food, cramped conditions, danger, and long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. A raiding voyage would start with preparations that take weeks. The ship would need to be readied, provisions gathered, crew assembled, and sacrifices made for good luck. The provisions would be the same dried and salted foods you eat at home, plus water in barrels that would become stale and stagnant during the voyage. Fresh food would run out quickly, and you'd be living on hard rations that make your daily diet look appealing. The voyage itself would be spent rowing or sailing, depending on the wind. When rowing, you'd be on those hard wooden chests again, pulling on heavy oars in rhythm with your shipmates for hours at a time. Your hands would blister, heal, and blister again. Your back and shoulders would be one solid ache. When sailing, you'd have less to do, but the ship would be pitching and rolling with the waves, making you queasy if you're not used to it. Seasickness would affect even experienced sailors sometimes, and if you're unlucky enough to be sick, you'd be hanging over the side of the ship trying not to fall in while your stomach turns inside out. Your crewmates would offer no sympathy because they've all been there, and besides, there's nothing anyone can do about it except wait for it to pass. You'd feel dreadful, weak, shaky, and thoroughly miserable, but you'd still need to take your turn rowing once you're capable of standing. Sleeping on the ship would mean wrapping yourself in your cloak and finding a space between the rowing benches, or under a tent-like cover if the weather is bad. You'd be damp from sea spray, cold from the wind, and trying to wedge yourself in so the ship's motion doesn't roll you around. Sleep would come in short bursts, and you'd be chronically tired for the entire voyage. Medical care in the Viking Age would be rudimentary at best and terrifying at worst. If you got sick or injured, your options would be limited to herbal remedies, basic surgery, and hoping your body heals itself. There'd be people in the community with healing knowledge, usually women, who understand which herbs help with which ailments. They'd make poultices, teas, and salves from plants, and some of these would actually work because many modern medicines are derived from the same plants. A simple infection could turn serious quickly without antibiotics. That blister on your hand from rowing could become inflamed and swollen, red streaks creeping up your arm. The healer would apply a poultice of honey and herbs, both of which have antibacterial properties, and you'd hope it works. You'd be told to rest, which is difficult when there's work to be done, and you'd worry constantly about whether the infection is getting better or worse. Broken bones would be set by someone with experience, but without anesthesia the process would be agonizing. You'd bite down on a leather strap while your leg is pulled straight and splinted with sticks and bindings. The pain would be so intense you might pass out, which would actually be a mercy. Recovery would take weeks or months, during which you'd be unable to work and dependent on others. In a society where everyone needs to contribute, being injured is both physically and socially difficult. Dental problems would be inevitable given the diet and lack of proper dental care. Tooth decay would lead to toothaches that range from annoying to absolutely unbearable. When a tooth gets bad enough, the only solution would be to have it pulled. Someone would grip the tooth with iron pincers and yank, hopefully getting it out in one piece. The pain would be extreme, there'd be a lot of mess, and afterwards you'd have a bleeding hole in your mouth that takes days to heal. You'd be eating soft foods and trying not to disturb the wound, which is difficult when your diet consists largely of things that require chewing. Headaches would be common from the smoke-filled longhouse, eye strain from working in dim light, tension from stress, and dehydration from not drinking enough water. You'd have no painkillers except possibly willow bark tea, which contains the compound that aspirin is made from. It would help a bit, but not like a modern painkiller. You'd mostly just have to endure the pain and try to carry on with your work. Joint pain from the constant physical labour and damp living conditions would affect nearly everyone, especially as they age. Your knees, back, shoulders and hips would ache on cold mornings, and it would take a while of moving around before they'd loosen up. There'd be no treatment except heat, rest and herbal rubs that might help a little. You'd accept that pain is just part of life and learn to work through it. Cuts and scrapes would be frequent from working with sharp tools, rough materials, and being around animals. Minor wounds would be washed and left to heal, and usually they would, but sometimes they wouldn't. You'd know people who lost fingers, toes, or even limbs to infections that started from trivial injuries. Every cut would carry that risk, making you cautious but not cautious enough to prevent the inevitable accidents. Burns would be common from working around open fires. You'd have small burn scars on your hands and arms from splashes of hot liquid, touching hot metal accidentally, or getting too close to flames. Most burns would be minor and heal with the application of cool water and possibly a soothing salve. Serious burns would be agonizing and potentially fatal if they covered a large area, with nothing to offer for pain except perhaps strong alcohol to dull the senses. Stomach troubles would plague everyone occasionally. Bad food, contaminated water, or just the stress of life would give you cramps, nausea, or worse. You'd be making frequent trips outside to the latrine area, which would be a pit dug some distance from the main buildings. Squatting over a pit in the cold or rain while your stomach is rebelling would be utterly miserable. The remedies would be herbal teas that might help settle your stomach, or might just give you something warm to drink while you wait for it to pass. The latrine pit itself would be exactly as disgusting as you're imagining. It would smell terrible, obviously, and in summer the flies would be unbelievable. A cloud of buzzing insects would rise up when you approach, and some of them would be large and determined. You'd try to be quick about your business, but urgency and dignity don't go together. In winter, at least the cold would keep the smell down and the flies away. But then, you'd have to deal with freezing temperatures in a very vulnerable position. Parasites would be an unpleasant fact of life. Intestinal worms would be common from undercooked meat or contaminated food. You'd be told to take a purgative, a foul-tasting herbal mixture that would cause everything in your digestive system to evacuate rapidly and forcefully. This would hopefully clear out the worms, and you'd feel weak and shaky afterwards, but hopefully better in the long run. There'd be no way to confirm the worms are gone except by not having symptoms anymore. Skin conditions would range from rashes and boils to serious infections. The combination of infrequent washing, scratchy wool clothing, shared living spaces, and constant exposure to dirt would create perfect conditions for skin problems. A boil would start as a tender lump, growing bigger and more painful until it's ready to burst. The healer might lance it with a hot knife to drain the contents, and the relief when the pressure is released would be immediate despite the pain of the procedure. Eyesight problems would have no solution. If you need glasses, you'd just have to cope with blurry vision. Reading and close work would be difficult, and distance vision problems would be dangerous when sailing or hunting. You'd learn to compensate, asking others to help with tasks you can't manage, and hoping your vision doesn't worsen too much. Going blind would be a disaster, leaving you dependent on your family's goodwill for survival. Hearing loss from age, injury, or repeated exposure to loud noises would similarly have no remedy. You just speak louder and ask people to repeat themselves, becoming that person everyone has to yell at. In a society that values storytelling and oral communication, being hard of hearing would be isolating. Women's health issues would be dealt with using a combination of practical measures and herbal remedies. Monthly cycles would be managed with cloth that's washed and reused, which would be uncomfortable and inconvenient, but workable. The cloths would be washed separately in cold water to prevent staining, then dried somewhere discreet. You'd need to plan around your cycle for activities like long journeys or feast attendance, and sometimes your plans would be disrupted anyway. Pregnancy would be an inevitable part of life for most women, and it would be dangerous. There'd be no prenatal care, no scans, no way to know if anything is wrong until it's too late. You'd continue working as long as possible because there's no one else to do your jobs. Morning sickness would be dealt with by eating dry bread and hoping it stays down. The growing baby would make everything harder, bending over, carrying things, sleeping comfortably, and you'd still be expected to keep up with your responsibilities. Let's talk about the smell issue more thoroughly because we've touched on it, but not really conveyed just how much everything would reek. Your nose would adjust somewhat, the same way you stop noticing a smell after being exposed to it for a while, but visitors from other settlements would often comment on the distinctive aroma of each homestead. You'd probably think your own longhouse smells normal, while finding other people's homes offensive, not realizing yours smells just as bad to them. The base layer of smell would be smoke, always smoke, permeating everything. Your clothes, your hair, your bedding, the walls, everything would carry that wood smoke scent. On top of that would be the human smell of too many people living close together without modern hygiene. Sweat, breath, bodies, it all combines into a musty funk that would be strongest in the morning before everyone airs out by going outside to work. Animal smells would drift in from the sheds and pens nearby. On warm days when the wind is wrong, you'd get full-strength barnyard aroma wafting through the settlement. The pigs especially would contribute a thick, earthy stink that you'd taste as well as smell. The chickens would add their own sharp ammoniac note from their droppings. The cattle and goats would provide a warm, grassy animal scent that's not entirely unpleasant, but definitely noticeable. Food preparation would add cooking smells that would be appetizing when you're hungry, but cloying after hours of exposure. Boiling cabbage would fill the longhouse with a sulphurous smell that lingers. Fish being smoked or cooked would add their distinctive odor. Bread baking would actually smell good, one of the few genuinely pleasant smells, warm and yeasty and making your mouth water. But bread baking would be occasional, while cabbage and fish would be constant. Fermentation would be happening in various corners. Ale brewing, cabbage fermenting for preservation, possibly fish being fermented in barrels. Each fermentation process would have its own sharp, tangy smell. The ale brewing would be sweet and beery. The sauerkraut would be sour and vinegary. Fermented fish would be intensely pungent, eye-watering stuff that would be an acquired taste, to put it mildly. Personal body smells would vary depending on what work someone has been doing. Come back from fishing, and you'd reek of fish so strongly that people would smell you coming. Spend the day mucking out animal pens, and you'd smell like exactly what you've been standing in all day. Work in the forge, and you'd smell of smoke and hot metal and sweat. Spend the day making cheese, and you'd smell sour and milky. Wet wool would be a common smell, especially in rainy weather, and it's not good. Think of damp sheep, that lanolin-heavy, musky smell, except it's your clothes, and you can't get away from it. The smell would intensify with body heat, creating a steamy funk around everyone who came in from the rain. The longhouse, after everyone returns from outdoor work in wet weather, would be impressively smelly, a wall of damp wool and bodies that hits you when you open the door. Leather goods would add their own scent, that distinctive tanned hide smell that some people find pleasant and others find musty. Your boots, belt, bags and straps would all carry it. When leather gets wet, it would smell stronger, more intense, and take forever to dry out properly. Wet leather boots would make your feet smell terrible, a sweaty leather combination that would make you reluctant to remove your boots around others. Your own body would smell in ways that modern you would find shocking. Without deodorant, your underarms would develop a strong smell during physical work. It would be sharp and tangy, getting stronger as the day goes on. Everyone else would smell the same way, so there'd be no embarrassment about it, but modern you would be mortified. Your feet would be similarly pungent from being trapped in damp leather boots all day, and taking your boots off in the evening would release a cloud of foot odour that's best not described in detail. Your breath wouldn't be fresh. There's no toothpaste, no mints, no mouthwash. You'd have morning breath all day, plus the smell of whatever you ate would linger. Garlic and onions would be particularly persistent. The dried fish in your diet would make your breath fishy. The ale you drink would make it slightly sour and yeasty. Close conversation would mean smelling the other person's breath, and them smelling yours, and everyone would just accept it as normal. Hair would be another source of interesting smells. Washed infrequently, and often treated with oil or fat to make it manageable, your hair would have a greasy smell mixed with whatever oil was used. Some people might use scented oils if they could afford them, which would help, but most would just use plain animal fat and their hair would smell accordingly. Your beard, if you have one, would trap food smells and smoke, becoming a collection of the day's experiences. The privy area downwind of the settlement would be detectable from some distance, especially in warm weather. You'd learn to breathe shallowly when heading in that direction. The smell would be thick and organic, and there'd be no way to make it pleasant. In winter, the cold would suppress it somewhat, but in summer, it would be formidable. Flies would cluster in the area, fat and numerous and disgusting. Dead things would be a periodic smell issue. An animal would die and need to be disposed of, or you'd be butchering livestock and the waste parts would need to be dealt with. The smell of death and decay would be sickeningly sweet and meaty, making your stomach turn even when you're used to harsh smells. You'd try to handle these situations quickly, but sometimes a dead rat in the walls or a bird that died in the roof would go undiscovered until the smell reveals it. The seasonal changes would bring different smell profiles. Spring would smell of mud and animal waste and new growth, earthy and organic. Summer would be warmer and ripening, with growing things and flowers mixing with the usual human and animal smells. Autumn would bring the smell of harvest, grain dust and fruit, and the slight fermentation of fallen apples. Winter would actually smell cleanest because the cold suppresses smells, but indoor smells would intensify from everyone being cooped up inside. Your hands would be a particular problem area. Working hands that handle fish, animals, earth, leather and wool all day would absorb smells that won't easily wash away. Your fingernails would have dirt under them that's nearly impossible to clean out completely. The creases in your palms would be stained and hold smells. You'd eat with these hands, and you'd have stopped caring because everyone's hands are the same. Sleeping areas would develop their own concentrated smell from the combination of straw, wool, furs, and the people sleeping there night after night. Each sleeping platform would smell distinctly of its occupants. You'd recognize family members partly by smell, knowing without looking who's sleeping nearby. This isn't romantic, it's just a fact of life when privacy is minimal and washing is infrequent. The overall effect would be a richly layered smell environment that would be overwhelming to a time traveler, but normal to you. You'd notice when smells change or intensify, warning you of problems like spoiling food or illness. You'd find some smells comforting because they mean home and safety. The smell of your longhouse fire would be welcoming after a long day, even though objectively it's a combination of smoke and people and animals that modern sensibilities would find appalling. You'd develop preferences for certain smells and aversions to others. Fresh bread would be universally enjoyed. The smell of the sea would be loved by some and disliked by others. The smell of the forge would be exciting if you enjoy that work, or unpleasant if you don't. Flowers and herbs would be appreciated when available. Small bright notes in the generally earthy smell landscape. Let's discuss clothing in more detail, because what you wear would be a constant source of discomfort that you'd never quite get used to. Everything would be made from wool, linen or leather, and nothing would fit the way modern clothes fit. There'd be no elastic, no zippers, no buttons in the way you know them. Your clothes would be held together with brooches, pins, ties, and hope. The tunic would be a basic T-shape, boxy and loose, belted at the waist to keep it from flapping around while you work. The wool would be scratchy against your skin, especially when new. Over time it would soften slightly with wear and the natural oils from your body, but it would never be what you'd call comfortable. The weave would be uneven because it's handmade on that upright loom, with thick spots and thin spots throughout the fabric. The thick spots would be stiff and the thin spots would be fragile, wearing through faster and requiring patches. Patches would be everywhere on everyday clothing. Nothing would be thrown away while it's still wearable, so your tunic might have patches on patches, different colours and textures of wool creating a map of repairs over the years. You'd be proud of your ability to make clothing last, because fabric is expensive and time-consuming to produce. Throwing away a garment with a hole would be wasteful when you could patch it and get more years of use. Your undergarments would be a simple linen shift, the only layer between your skin and the scratchy wool. The linen would be softer than wool but still rougher than modern fabric, woven from flax that was grown, harvested, processed, spun, and woven all by hand. When clean and dry, the linen would be the most comfortable thing you wear. When dirty and damp, it would be clammy and unpleasant, clinging to your skin in ways that make you want to tear it off. Trousers for men would be loose and baggy, tied at the waist and often wrapped with strips of cloth from ankle to knee for extra warmth and protection. These leg wrappings would need to be done fresh each morning, winding the cloth strips in overlapping layers that stay secure through the day's work. Getting them even and tight enough would be a skill you develop, and when done wrong they'd come unwound at inconvenient moments, leaving you hopping around trying to retie them while keeping your trousers up. Women's clothing would be layers of linen shift, wool dress, and often a second overdress or apron held up with those brooches. The brooches would be decorative but also functional, pinning the straps of your overdress to the underdress beneath. They'd be metal, possibly silver or bronze if you have any wealth, or simple iron if you don't. The pins would be sharp, and you'd occasionally stab yourself while adjusting your clothing, adding another small injury to the collection. The weight of all these layers would be considerable. You'd be carrying several pounds of fabric on your body, and when wet, it would be much heavier. Walking in wet wool would feel like someone's attached weights to you, the sodden fabric pulling at your shoulders and dragging with every step. Your body heat would eventually start to dry the inner layers, creating that steamy, damp wool smell we discussed, and you'd remain vaguely damp for hours. Footwear would be a constant concern because good boots are essential and also difficult to maintain. Your boots would be leather, probably turn shoes where the leather is sewn inside out and then turned right side in, creating a smooth exterior but putting the seams inside where they'd rub against your feet. The sole would be a single layer of thicker leather, offering minimal cushioning between your feet and the ground. You'd feel every stone, every root, every bump in your path. Breaking in new boots would be an ordeal of blisters and pain. The stiff leather would rub your heels, ankles and toes raw before it softened enough to be comfortable. You'd stuff the boots with wool or straw to help them hold shape when you're not wearing them, and you'd treat them with fat or oil to keep the leather supple and water resistant. This treatment would help, but leather boots would never be truly waterproof, and your feet would get wet regularly. Socks would be knitted or made from cut fabric, wool again, and they'd be lumpy with uneven stitching. The lumps would create pressure points inside your boots, and you'd develop calluses in strange places on your feet. Holes in your socks would be darned repeatedly, creating thick patches that create new pressure points. You'd dream of smooth, soft, well-fitting footwear, and not even have the vocabulary to describe what you're imagining. Headwear would be essential for outdoor work. Men might wear a simple cloth cap or nothing at all, while women would cover their hair once married, keeping it bound up under a headcloth. The head covering would serve multiple purposes, keeping hair out of the way while working, providing warmth, protecting from sun, and meeting social expectations. It would be tied in various ways depending on what you're doing, and you develop favourite tying methods that stay secure. In winter, you'd add more layers, wrapping yourself in additional tunics, cloaks, shawls, and anything else that might provide warmth. You'd look bulky and shapeless, padding yourself like you're preparing for a fall. The outer cloak would be your most valuable garment, made from the best wool you can afford or produce, thick and felted to resist water and wind. A good cloak could last for years and would be carefully maintained, brushed, repaired, and treated with respect. The cloak would be fastened with a brooch at the shoulder, and the weight of wet wool would pull at that single point all day. Your shoulder would be sore from the constant pressure, and you'd shift the cloak around periodically to distribute the weight differently. In strong wind, the cloak would try to fly away, wrapping around your head or tangling your arms, and you'd be constantly wrestling with it to keep it under control. Jewellery would be minimal for most people, but the pieces you own would be important. Those brooches holding your clothes together would be both functional and decorative, showing your status and wealth. A silver brooch would be a significant possession, something you'd guard carefully and might trade if times get desperate. Arm rings would serve as portable wealth, silver or gold bands that could be cut into pieces to make payments. You'd wear them with pride, showing that you or your family has resources. Getting dressed in the morning would be a process. You'd pull on your linen shift, add the wool tunic or dress, belt it, add the overdress if you're wearing one, pin it in place, add leg wrappings and trousers if you're a man, pull on your socks, carefully work your feet into your boots and lace them up, wrap your headcloth if needed, and finally add your cloak if you're going outside. On cold mornings you'd be rushing through this while shivering, fingers clumsy with cold, struggling with ties and laces. Undressing at night would be a relief, peeling off the day's layers and the grime they've accumulated. But you'd only remove the outer layers, sleeping in your linen shift and maybe a wool layer if it's cold. The concept of special sleeping clothes would be foreign. You'd sleep in a simplified version of day wear. The relief of removing your belt and boots would be significant, letting your body relax from the constriction and support. Changing clothes completely would happen rarely, perhaps weekly at best. You'd have one set of everyday work clothes and maybe one better set for social occasions, if you're lucky. The work clothes would be stained, patched, worn thin in places, but serviceable. The better set would be newer, cleaner, less patched, save for feasts and assemblies and important visitors. You'd feel strange in your good clothes, too aware of them, worried about damaging or dirtying them. Now let's discuss what would happen if you got injured seriously enough that you couldn't work. In a society where everyone's labour is essential for survival, being incapacitated would create real problems, not just for you, but for your entire household. There's no sick leave, no disability payment, no social services to fall back on. Your family and community would help, but their resources are limited and they have their own work to do. A serious injury like a broken leg would put you out of action for months. During that time, you'd be lying on your sleeping platform, trying to contribute what you can, but mostly just healing and feeling guilty about being a burden. You might be able to do sitting work, mending clothes, preparing vegetables, spinning thread, carving, anything that doesn't require standing or walking. But the main work of the household would fall to others, who'd already have their own responsibilities. The boredom would be crushing. You're used to being active all day, working until you're exhausted, and suddenly you're immobile with nothing to do but think and watch others work. The days would drag, each one feeling like a week. You'd try to be cheerful and not complain, because complaining wouldn't help and would make you unpleasant to be around. But inside, you'd be frustrated and worried about healing properly. The enforced stillness would make you aware of every ache and itch. That broken leg would throb with every heartbeat at first, gradually settling into a constant dull ache punctuated by sharp pains when you move wrong. The splint would be rigid and uncomfortable, and the binding would be tight enough to restrict the swelling, but also tight enough to make your skin itch underneath where you can't scratch. You'd worry constantly about whether the bone is setting straight. If it heals crooked, you might walk with a limp forever, making you less capable of work and therefore less valuable to the household. There'd be no x-rays to check the alignment, just the healer's experienced hands feeling the break and their best judgment about whether it's positioned correctly. You'd have to trust their skill and hope for the best. Muscle wasting would happen quickly from disuse. Your injured leg would become noticeably thinner than the other one, the muscles shrinking from lack of work. When you finally get the splint off and try to walk, the leg would be weak and shaky, barely able to support your weight. Relearning to walk would be frustrating and painful, each step tentative, and you'd need to lean heavily on a stick until strength returns. Other household members would bring you food and help with personal needs, which would be humiliating. You're an adult used to managing your own affairs, and now you need help getting to the chamber pot or washing yourself. You try to maintain dignity while accepting necessary help, but it would erode your sense of self-reliance. The helpers would be patient or impatient depending on their temperament, and you'd be grateful either way because you have no choice. If an injury resulted in permanent disability, your future would become uncertain. A hand that doesn't work properly, a foot that drags, persistent pain that limits what you can do. All of these would change your role in the household. You'd need to find new ways to contribute, taking on tasks that accommodate your limitations. Pride would have to be swallowed as you accept that you can't do what you once did. Some people would adapt well, finding new skills and new value. A farmer who can't walk long distances might become a skilled craftsperson working from home. A warrior who's lost the use of his sword arm might become an advisor or trader. But the adjustment would be difficult, mourning the loss of your former capabilities while trying to build a new identity. Not everyone would manage it gracefully. The community's attitude toward disability would be practical rather than charitable. If you can contribute something, you'd be valued for what you can do. If you're completely unable to work, you'd be dependent on family loyalty and community goodwill, which would be offered but not unlimited. The harsh reality is that resources are finite and everyone needs to pull their weight somehow. This would create pressure to recover quickly or find ways to be useful despite limitations. Mental health struggles would be even less understood than physical injuries. If you developed what we'd call depression or anxiety, it would be seen as weakness or perhaps a spiritual problem rather than a medical condition. You'd be told to pull yourself together, offer sacrifices to the gods, or see a Velva, a wise woman who might perform rituals or give advice. Whether any of this would help would depend on your belief in it and the placebo effect. The constant stress of Viking life would wear on everyone's mental state. Worry about harvests, fear during raids, grief from losing loved ones, the endless physical exhaustion, all of it would accumulate. You'd see people who seem beaten down by life, moving through their days without joy or energy. And you'd understand because you'd feel the same way sometimes. There'd be no therapy, no medication, just the expectation that you'd endure. Some people would cope by drinking, consuming enough ale or mead to dull the edges of their life. This would provide temporary relief, but solve nothing and create new problems. A drunk person is less productive, more likely to cause arguments, and still has all the same problems waiting when they sober up. The household would tolerate a certain amount of drinking, especially at social occasions, but excessive drinking that interferes with work would be condemned. Sleep would be the main escape from troubles, but sleep would often be elusive. The discomfort of your sleeping arrangements, the noise of the long house, the worries spinning in your head, all of it would make for restless nights. You'd lie awake listening to others snore, watching the shadows from the fire, running through problems and potential solutions until your mind is tired, but still won't shut off. Morning would come too soon, and you'd face another day exhausted before it begins. Accidents would be common in a world full of sharp tools, large animals, open fires, and physical labour. You'd see people with missing fingers from axe accidents, scars from burns, limps from old injuries, and you'd have your own collection of scars as well. Each scar would have a story: the time you slipped while gutting fish, the time the axe glanced off a knot in the wood, the time you grabbed a hot pot handle without thinking. These scars would be marks of a working life, proof that you've been doing your share of the labour. Young people with smooth, unscarred hands would be viewed as inexperienced or lazy, not yet properly tested by work. Your scarred, calloused hands would be ugly by modern standards, but respected in your community as the hands of someone who works hard and contributes. Animal-related injuries would be particularly common. A kick from a cow, a bite from a pig, being scratched by chickens, stepped on by an ox, or head-butted by a goat. All of these would happen to everyone eventually. The animals are large, strong, and have their own ideas about what they want to do, which doesn't always align with your plans. You'd learn to be alert around animals, watching their body language for warning signs, but you'd still get hurt sometimes. Let's talk about the absolute monotony of the diet, because while we've mentioned various foods, we haven't fully conveyed how you'd be eating the same things day after day after day. There's no grocery store with global options, no takeaway when you don't feel like cooking, no variety beyond what can be locally produced or occasionally traded. Your diet would be determined by season and geography, and exciting culinary adventures wouldn't exist. Porridge would be breakfast most days, made from whatever grain you have most of. Barley porridge would be greyish and gloopy, filling but not exciting. Oat porridge would be similar, maybe slightly tastier but still just a bowl of cooked grain. You'd eat it because you're hungry, and it's hot, and it provides energy for the day's work. Sometimes there'd be butter mixed in, or a bit of honey if you're very lucky, or dried berries that provide little bursts of flavour in the bland grain. The same fish would appear in various forms throughout the week. Fresh fish if it's fishing season, dried fish the rest of the time, smoked fish occasionally, but it's all fish. Herring, cod, whatever the local waters provide in abundance. You'd eat fish with porridge, fish with bread, fish in stew, fish on its own, until the thought of fish would make you slightly queasy, but you'd eat it anyway, because it's food, and food is valuable. Dairy products would provide some variety. Milk fresh from the animal while it lasts, which isn't long without refrigeration, turning into yogurt or cheese to preserve it. The cheese would be a hard, crumbly type aged, until it's safe to store. Sharp and salty and good in small amounts, but that's all you'd get, small amounts. The milk would taste strongly of whatever the animal has been eating, which in spring would be fresh grass and herbs, giving it a complex flavour that's actually quite nice, but in winter would be hay and stored feed, making it taste dusty. Bread would be heavy and dense, made from rye or barley flour, ground on a quernstone, which means tiny particles of stone would be in the flour and therefore in the bread. Over years of eating this bread, Your teeth would be gradually ground down by the stone particles, wearing away the enamel. The bread would be filling and provide a different texture from porridge, and you'd be grateful for it, even as it's slowly destroying your teeth. Vegetables would be the same ones repeatedly. Turnips, cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans. These would be boiled into submission, cooked until soft, because that's how cooking works over an open fire with limited control of temperature. Crisp vegetables would be something you eat fresh from the garden briefly in summer, but most of the time your vegetables would be mushy and mild. Turnips would show up in everything because they grow well and store well, and by late winter you'd be thoroughly sick of turnips but still eating turnip stew. Herbs would be the main source of flavour variation. Dill, parsley, thyme, whatever grows locally and can be dried for winter use. These would be added to stews and porridge in quantities that seem generous when you're used to bland food, but wouldn't register as strongly flavoured to a modern palate. Salt would be precious because it's essential for food preservation, and you'd use it carefully, never quite adding enough to make food taste properly seasoned. Meat would be a sometimes food, not a daily occurrence. When an animal is slaughtered, you'd eat fresh meat for a few days, enjoying the richness and protein, but most of the meat would be preserved immediately for later. Salted meat would be soaked before cooking to remove some of the salt, then boiled or stewed until tender. The preserved meat would have a different texture from fresh, firmer, and sometimes a bit stringy, but it would still be meat and therefore valued. The lack of sugar would be one of the hardest adjustments for a modern person. No sweets, no chocolate, no cakes or biscuits, no fizzy drinks. Honey would be the only sweetener, rare and expensive, used sparingly when used at all. Your palate would adjust, and you'd find sweetness in things that don't seem sweet to modern tastes. A carrot, an apple, berries. These natural sugars would be enough to satisfy cravings that you'd forget you once had for concentrated sweetness. Fruit would be seasonal and brief. Berry season would be a frenzy of picking and eating and preserving. Apples would come in autumn, eaten fresh, dried for storage, or made into a simple cider. The fruit wouldn't be the large, perfectly bred varieties of modern times. It would be smaller, sometimes tart, sometimes wormy, but still welcomed eagerly. You'd eat around the bad bits and not waste any of the good parts. Nuts would be foraged from the forest, hazelnuts mainly, collected in autumn and stored for winter. Cracking nuts would be evening entertainment, sitting by the fire and crushing shells to get at the small kernels inside. Your fingers would be sore from the work and your teeth would ache from helping to crack stubborn shells, but the flavour of fresh nuts would be worth it. By late winter, the stored nuts would be drying out and losing flavour, but you'd still eat them because they're food. Mushrooms would be gathered by people who know which ones are safe, because mushroom poisoning would be a real and terrifying risk. The safe varieties would be cooked into stews or dried for later use, adding an earthy flavour and meaty texture. You'd never be completely confident about mushroom identification, always slightly nervous that someone has made a mistake, but you'd eat them because mushrooms make the meal more interesting. Wild garlic would be gathered enthusiastically in spring, the first fresh green thing available. Everyone would eat so much of it that the entire settlement would reek of garlic for weeks, but no one would care because fresh flavours after winter preserved foods would be so welcomed. Your breath would be terrible, your sweat would smell of garlic, but you'd keep eating it because it tastes alive, in a way that dried foods don't. Seaweed would be gathered from the shore if you live near the coast, adding minerals and a salty ocean flavour to stews. The texture would be slippery and strange if you're not used to it, but it would be nutritious and free for the gathering. You'd learn to appreciate it as you learn to appreciate all foods that add variety to the monotonous diet. The The drinking options would be limited to water, ale, and occasionally mead. Water would be your main drink, from the well or spring or stream, tasting of whatever container it's stored in, and sometimes of algae or minerals or just mustiness. Ale would be weak enough to drink throughout the day, providing calories and making questionable water safer to drink through the fermentation process. It would be cloudy and yeasty and only slightly alcoholic, more like liquid bread than what modern people consider beer. Tea would be made from herbs when someone is ill or wants something warm, but it wouldn't be the sophisticated beverage of later centuries. Mint tea or chamomile tea would be made by pouring hot water over a handful of herbs and waiting for it to steep. The flavour would be mild, and the experience would be more about having something hot to drink than about the specific taste. You develop deep appreciation for foods when they are in season and available. The first fresh greens of spring, the first berries of summer, the first apples of autumn, each would be celebrated and savoured. The memory of these seasonal treats would sustain you through months of preserved foods, reminding you that variety will come again when the seasons turn. Transportation would be another aspect of Viking life that would test your patience and endurance. There's no hopping in a car or on a bus. Every journey would be made on foot, by boat or on horseback if you're wealthy enough to own a horse. Distance would be measured not in miles but in days of travel, and every journey would be an expedition requiring planning and preparation. Walking would be your primary mode of transport. The settlement might have a few horses or oxen, but these would be working animals for ploughing and hauling, not for riding whenever you fancy. So if you need to go somewhere, you'd walk. Your boots would squelch through mud, slip on wet grass, crunch through snow, and gradually fall apart from the constant use. A journey to the next settlement might be several hours of walking, and you just accept that this is how long it takes. The paths between settlements would be rough tracks, not maintained roads. They'd be muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry weather, and always uneven with roots, rocks, and holes waiting to trip you. Walking would require constant attention to where you put your feet, especially when carrying anything. You develop a steady, ground-eating pace that could be maintained for hours, and your legs would be strong from the constant walking. Travelling alone would be risky, so people would usually go in groups when possible. There'd be wild animals in the forests, though they'd mostly avoid humans. More concerning would be outlaws and strangers who might see a lone traveller as an easy target. The social aspect of group travel would make the journey more pleasant anyway, with conversation and shared watches at night if the journey requires camping. If the journey is long enough to require overnight stops, you'd be camping rough or hoping for hospitality at settlements along the way. Hospitality would be a sacred obligation, with hosts expected to provide shelter and food to travellers, and travellers expected to be courteous guests and share news from elsewhere. You'd sleep on the floor of a stranger's longhouse, grateful for the roof over your head, and repay the kindness with stories and whatever small gift you can offer. Camping in the forest would be uncomfortable and slightly frightening. You'd build a fire for warmth and light, huddle close to it in your cloak, and try to sleep sitting up or lying on the cold ground, with nothing but your cloak between you and the dirt. Every sound would be amplified in the darkness. Branches cracking, animals moving, wind in the trees. You'd tell yourself it's nothing dangerous, but you'd still be alert and nervous, sleeping lightly and waking often. River crossings would be obstacles requiring either a bridge, which would be rare, or wading through cold water hoping it's not too deep. You'd strip off your boots and trousers to keep them dry, bundle them on top of your head, and wade in. The water would be shockingly cold. The riverbed would be slippery with rocks and mud, and the current would be stronger than it looks. You'd move carefully, feeling ahead with your feet, trying not to lose your balance and soak everything. In winter, travel would be dangerous enough that people would avoid it unless absolutely necessary. The days would be short, the cold could be fatal if you're caught out overnight, and snow would hide the paths and landmarks. If you must travel in winter, you'd bundle up in every layer you own, bring supplies in case you're delayed, and pray that the weather holds until you reach your destination. Sea travel would be faster than walking for long distances, but would come with its own miseries that we've touched on but should expand. The constant motion of the boat would be tiring even when you're not rowing. Your body would be tensed against the movement, trying to maintain balance on a wet, tilting deck. After a day at sea, you'd be exhausted from this constant tension. Your muscles sore in ways that land-based work doesn't cause. Navigation would be done by landmarks, the sun, stars, and accumulated knowledge of currents and winds. There'd be no GPS, no detailed charts, just memory and experience. Getting lost would be a real possibility, especially in fog or cloudy weather that hides the sun and stars. You'd keep land in sight when possible, hugging the coast and stopping frequently. Heading out of sight of land would be undertaken only by experienced sailors on sturdy ships, and even they would be nervous about it. Storms at sea would be terrifying. The waves would toss your boat around like a toy. Water would pour over the sides faster than you can bail it out, and you'd be holding on for your life while trying to keep the boat pointed into the waves. The noise would be overwhelming. Wind shrieking, waves crashing, timber creaking, people shouting. You'd be convinced you're about to die, and you might be right, but the storm would eventually pass, and you'd find yourself still alive, soaked and shaking, and grateful to see calmer water. Horses would be available to wealthy people, and riding a Viking-era horse would be different from modern horseback riding. These horses would be smaller, stockier, and closer to ponies in size. They'd be tough and hardy, but not particularly fast or smooth to ride. The saddle would be basic, just a wooden frame with some padding, and stirrups would be a relatively new innovation in the Viking age. You'd be sore after a day of riding, your inner thighs rubbed raw and your backside bruised from the pounding. Caring for a horse would be a significant responsibility. The animal would need feeding, grooming, hoof care, and shelter. In return, it would provide transport and prestige, showing that you have the resources to maintain such a valuable animal. You'd become attached to a good horse, appreciating its personality and capabilities, and losing one would be both an emotional and financial blow. Oxen and carts would be used for hauling heavy loads, moving at a walking pace but able to carry far more than a person could. The cart would be a simple wooden platform on two wheels, creaking and jolting over rough paths. You'd walk alongside the ox, guiding it with a stick and voice commands, patiently accepting its slow pace. Loading and unloading the cart would be heavy work, lifting sacks of grain or barrels of fish, your back straining with each load. The concept of being somewhere quickly would be foreign. Everything would take time. Walking takes time, sailing takes time, loading carts takes time, and you'd plan accordingly. If you need to be somewhere for a specific event, you'd leave days early to ensure you arrive on time. The journey would be part of the experience, not just an annoying necessity to endure. Messages would be carried by people traveling anyway, or by someone specifically sent with important news. There's no postal service, no phones, no instant communication. If you want to tell someone something, you'd either go tell them yourself, or send someone you trust to deliver the message accurately. News would travel slowly, and you might not hear about important events for weeks or months after they happen. This slow pace of information would mean that your world would be small. You'd know your local area intimately and have some knowledge of nearby regions, but distant places would be hazy concepts based on stories from travelers. The idea That you could know what's happening on the other side of the world instantly would be incomprehensible magic. Trade goods would travel these same slow routes, passed from person to person, carried in ships and on pack animals, gradually making their way across vast distances. The amber from the Baltic, the silver from the Arab world, the fine cloth from Byzantium, all of it would travel for months to reach you, and the prices would reflect those difficulties. Exotic goods would be treasured both for their inherent qualities and for the stories of their origins. Let's discuss the skills you'd need to learn just to survive, because being a Viking would require competence in dozens of tasks that modern people never think about. You couldn't just be good at one job. You'd need to be capable of doing whatever needs doing, and the learning curve would be steep and unforgiving. Making mistakes would have real consequences, not just embarrassment, but genuine danger to yourself and others. Fire management would be a constant concern. Keeping the longhouse fire going would be someone's responsibility at all times, because letting it go out would mean the difficult task of starting it from scratch. You'd need to know how to build a fire that provides heat and light without filling the room with smoke, how to judge when to add wood, what types of wood burn best for cooking versus heating, and how to bank the fire at night so it stays alive until morning. Starting a fire without matches would be a skill you'd practice until you can do it reliably. You'd use a striker light, hitting a piece of flint or steel against another piece to create sparks that land on charred cloth or dried mushroom tinder. The sparks would be tiny and brief, and getting them to catch would require patience and the right technique. Once you have a glowing ember in your tinder, you'd carefully blow on it and feed it with increasingly larger pieces of kindling until you have actual flames. On damp days when everything is slightly wet, getting a fire started would be genuinely difficult. The tinder wouldn't catch easily, the kindling would be reluctant to burn, and you'd spend ages nursing tiny flames and praying they don't go out. Everyone would appreciate the person who's particularly skilled at fire starting, because it's a skill that makes everyone's life easier. Food preservation would be essential knowledge. You'd need to know how to salt meat and fish properly so it doesn't spoil, how to smoke foods so they dry without rotting, how to ferment vegetables so they keep through winter, how to make cheese that ages safely. Getting any of these processes wrong would mean wasted food, which would be a serious problem. Too little salt and the meat would rot, too much salt and it's inedible. The smoking fire needs to be cool enough not to cook the food, but warm enough to dry it properly. Butchering animals would be a necessary skill when livestock is slaughtered. You'd need to know how to kill the animal quickly and humanely, how to drain it properly, how to skin it without damaging the hide, how to separate meat from bone efficiently, and how to use every part because nothing would be wasted. The organs would be eaten or used for other purposes, the bones boiled for broth and marrow, the hide tanned for leather, even the intestines cleaned and used as sausage casings. The process would be messy and hard work. Your hands and arms would be covered in various substances. You'd be bent over the carcass for hours, and the smell would be strong and metallic and distinctly animal. But you'd push through because this animal represents food for months, and doing the job properly means your family eats well. Squeamishness would be a luxury you can't afford. Textile work would be essential for everyone, not just women, because clothes are vital and production is time-consuming. You'd need to know how to process flax into linen, starting with retting the flax stalks in water until they rot enough to separate the fibers, then breaking and combing them to get clean fibers ready for spinning. The process would take weeks and be smelly and labor-intensive. Wool processing would start with shearing the sheep, wrestling the animal into position, and carefully cutting the fleece off without nicking the skin. Then the wool would need to be washed to remove lanolin and dirt, picked clean of debris, combed to align the fibres, and finally spun into yarn. Your hands would be constantly working wool, and they'd smell like it, that distinctive lanolin scent that never quite washes away. Spinning would be something you do while doing other things, walking around with a drop spindle hanging from your hand, constantly twisting and drawing out the fibres. It would become automatic, your hands working without conscious thought, while you chat or walk or supervise other tasks. The pile of finished yarn would grow slowly, and you'd have a constant appreciation for how much work goes into a simple piece of fabric. Weaving would be more focused work, requiring attention and rhythm. You'd develop back problems from standing at the upright loom, shoulder problems from reaching up to work the upper portions, and finger problems from handling rough yarn for hours. But the cloth you produce would be essential, and there'd be satisfaction in watching a blank loom gradually fill with fabric you've created. Basic carpentry would be necessary for repairs and construction. You'd need to know how to split logs, shape wood with an axe and adze, fit joints together, and waterproof seams. The tools would be simple but effective in skilled hands, and learning to use them without injuring yourself would take practice and several close calls. Wood would be valued because trees must be felled, transported, and processed with huge amounts of labour. Rope and cord making would be another essential skill. You'd twist plant fibres or animal hair into cord, multiple cords into rope, creating the countless lengths needed for securing, pulling, tying, and holding things. Your fingers would be sore from the constant twisting motion, and you develop a feel for how tight to twist for strength without making the rope too stiff. Leatherworking would be necessary for boots, belts, bags, and countless other items. You'd need to know how to tan hides, turning raw skin into usable leather through a long process of soaking, scraping, treating, with tannins from bark or other sources, and working the leather until it's supple. The tanning process would smell terrible, and you'd be elbow deep in substances you'd rather not think about too carefully. Boat building would be a specialized skill, but you'd need at least basic knowledge of repairs. A leak in your boat isn't something you can ignore until you reach a shop. You'd need to patch it immediately with whatever materials you have available. Understanding how boats are constructed, where they're likely to develop problems, and how to fix them could save your life at sea. Navigation skills would be learned through experience and teaching from those who know. You'd memorize landmarks, learn to read the sky and water for weather signs, understand the patterns of currents and winds, and develop a sense for direction that doesn't rely on instruments. Getting lost would be more than inconvenient. It could be fatal, so these skills would be taken seriously. Fishing techniques would vary by season and target species. You'd know when and where different fish are likely to be, what bait or lures work best, how to set nets efficiently, how to handle fish safely once caught. You'd read the water looking for signs of fish, understanding how tide and weather affect their behaviour. Foraging knowledge would be extensive. You'd know which plants are edible, and when they're best harvested, which mushrooms are safe and which are deadly, where to find useful materials like reeds for thatching or bark for tanning. This knowledge would be learned from others and through careful observation, with mistakes potentially being your last. Weather prediction would be an inexact science based on observation. You'd watch cloud formations, wind direction, animal behaviour, and atmospheric signs, making educated guesses about what's coming. Getting it right would mean you bring in the hay before the rain or stay home instead of going to sea before a storm. Getting it wrong would mean wet hay or a dangerous voyage, so you'd always be checking the sky and sniffing the air. The social hierarchy would affect every aspect of your life in ways both obvious and subtle. Viking society had clear ranks, and your position would determine what opportunities you have, who you can marry, what compensation you'd receive for injuries, and how seriously people take your word. Being born into a certain class would largely determine your fate, though there'd be some mobility through success in raiding, trading, or marrying well. At the top would be the Jarls, the aristocracy who own significant land and have many dependents. They'd live in larger longhouses, have better possessions, and wield real power in the community. You'd probably not be a Jarl unless you were born into it, and you'd owe them respect and possibly service. When a Jarl speaks at the assembly, people would listen. When you speak, you'd need to be more careful because your words carry less weight. Most free Vikings would be carls, free farmers and craftspeople who own some property and have rights under the law. This would likely be your class. Not wealthy but not poor, independent but not powerful. You'd work your own land or practice your craft, pay your taxes or rents, and participate in community decisions. Your voice would matter in the assembly, though less than a Jarl's, and you'd have legal protections against being wronged. Below the free would be thralls, enslaved people with no legal rights. As a modern person, the existence of this institution would be deeply disturbing, but it would be a normal part of Viking society. Thralls would do the worst jobs, have the least food, and be property that could be bought, sold, or inherited. The line between Carl and Thrall would be one you desperately want to stay on the right side of, because falling into debt or being captured in a raid could result in enslavement. Your relationship with those above and below you in status would be carefully maintained. You'd show respect to Jarls through forms of address, body language, and behavior. You'd be careful not to offend them, because they have the power to make your life difficult. At the same time, you'd maintain your own dignity as a free person, not groveling but showing appropriate deference. With thralls, you might feel uncomfortable about the power imbalance, but you'd participate in the system because that's how society works. If your household owns thralls, you'd direct their work, and you'd probably be kind or cruel depending on your personality and how you were raised. The cognitive dissonance between seeing them as people and treating them as property would be something you'd have to navigate. Social obligations would structure your time and resources in ways that feel restrictive to modern sensibilities. If your neighbor needs help with harvest, you'd be expected to provide it, knowing they'll help you in return. If a relative gets in legal trouble, you'd be expected to support them at the assembly and possibly help pay their fines. If someone important visits, you'd be expected to offer hospitality, even if it strains your resources. These obligations would be enforced by social pressure and reputation rather than law. Failing to meet your obligations would damage your reputation, making others less willing to help you when you need it. The community would have a long memory, and your reliability would be part of your identity. Being known as someone who shirks obligations would make you an outcast gradually, as people find excuses not to interact with you. Gift giving would be an important social ritual that's more complex than it appears. Gifts would create obligations and relationships, demonstrating wealth and generosity. If someone gives you a gift, you'd be expected to reciprocate with something of similar value, creating a bond between you. A gift that's too small would be insulting, suggesting you're cheap or don't value the relationship. A gift that's too large would be showing off or creating an obligation the receiver can't match. You'd need to carefully judge what to give to whom, considering their status, your relationship, and what message you want to send. A fine knife might be appropriate for someone you want to develop stronger ties with. A carved cup might be right for a trading partner. Silver arm rings would be gifts between people of high status. Getting this wrong would cause offense or embarrassment. Feuds between families would dominate social dynamics in ways that seem bizarre to modern people. If someone from family A kills someone from family B, the entire families would be in conflict. Family B would be expected to seek compensation or revenge, and family A would be expected to pay or defend themselves. This could escalate over generations, with killings and counter-killings creating a tangled web of grievances. You might find yourself involved in a feud that started before you were born, honor-bound to support your kin against people you don't personally have problems with. The stress of an active feud would be constant, always watching for threats, avoiding certain areas, being careful not to give offense that could trigger violence. Peace negotiations would be delicate affairs, often involving compensation payments and hostages to ensure good behavior. Marriage would be primarily a practical arrangement between families rather than a romantic choice. Love might develop, or it might not, but that would be secondary to the alliance and economic benefits the marriage brings. Your family would be heavily involved in choosing your spouse, considering their family's reputation, their land and wealth, and what connections the marriage creates. Women would have more rights in Viking society than in many contemporary cultures, able to own property, divorce, and manage households. But they'd still be under male authority in most situations. A woman could divorce her husband for various reasons, including failure to provide, abuse, or his insistence on her wearing trousers, which apparently was grounds for divorce. She'd take her property with her and could remarry, though divorce would still be socially complicated. Men would be expected to be strong, brave, skilled, and successful. Failing to meet these expectations would damage your reputation and prospects. Being called a coward would be a serious insult that might require a formal response. Your honor would be tied to your actions and your family's actions, and defending that honor would sometimes require violence or the threat of it. Reputation would be everything, because it determines your place in society. A good reputation would mean people trust you, want to trade with you, offer their daughters in marriage, and support you in disputes. A bad reputation would mean isolation, poor marriage prospects, unfavorable judgments in disputes, and potentially being outlawed if you've done something serious enough. Building reputation would take years of consistent behavior, keeping your word, being generous when appropriate, showing bravery when called for, being skilled at your work, and treating others fairly. Destroying reputation could happen in a moment through cowardice, oath-breaking, or dishonorable behavior. The asymmetry would make you cautious about your actions, always considering how they'll be perceived. Storytelling would be how reputation is maintained and transmitted. The stories told about you at feasts and gatherings would shape how others see you. A good story about your bravery or generosity would enhance your reputation. A story about your failure would damage it. You'd be acutely aware of how your actions might be interpreted and told to others. The concept of personal privacy wouldn't really exist. You'd live in close quarters with extended family and possibly thralls, everyone aware of everyone else's business. Secrets would be hard to keep when you're sleeping in the same room as 20 other people. Your personal problems would be known to the household and probably to the wider community through gossip. Entertainment and leisure time would exist, but they'd be very different from modern recreation. There'd be no passive entertainment like television or movies. If you want entertainment, you'd have to create it yourself or participate in group activities. After a long day of exhausting work, the energy for entertainment would be limited, but people would still find ways to enjoy themselves and break up the monotony. Storytelling would be the primary evening entertainment, with the best storytellers being valued members of the community. They'd recount the old myths and legends, tell family histories, describe raids and voyages, and sometimes compose new stories about recent events. A good storyteller would use different voices, build tension, add dramatic pauses, and keep the audience engaged for hours. You'd know all the old stories by heart, but hearing them told well would still be enjoyable. The stories would serve multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They teach moral lessons, preserve history, maintain cultural identity, and reinforce social values. A story about a hero who kept his word would remind everyone of the importance of oaths. A story about a greedy person who came to a bad end would warn against excessive greed. You'd absorb these lessons along with the entertainment. Music would be simpler than modern music, but still enjoyed. Someone might have a lyre, a stringed instrument played by plucking or strumming. The melodies would be simple and repetitive by modern standards, but in a world without recorded music, live performance would be special. People would sing along with familiar songs, harmonizing roughly, creating a communal musical experience. The songs would include work songs with rhythms that help coordinate labor, drinking songs for feasts, laments for the dead, and boasting songs recounting great deeds. You'd know dozens of songs and would join in whenever singing starts. The quality of singing would vary wildly, but enthusiasm would make up for lack of skill. Being able to compose new verses to old tunes would be an admired skill. Games and contests would provide physical entertainment and competition. Wrestling would be popular, with impromptu matches breaking out at feasts or gatherings. You'd grapple with an opponent, trying to throw them down or force a submission, while others watch and cheer. It would be exhausting and sometimes result in minor injuries, but it would be fun and a way to prove your strength. Board games would be played in the evening around the fire. Nefertafel would be a popular strategy game played on a checkered board, with pieces trying to capture the king. The rules would be simple enough to learn, but complex enough to require thought and strategy. Games would be taken seriously, with players concentrating and spectators offering unwanted advice. Dice games would involve gambling small amounts, adding excitement and risk. The dice would be made from bone or antler, and you develop superstitions about them, blowing on them, talking to them, believing certain dice are lucky. Losing would sting, but the stakes would be kept small enough that it doesn't cause real problems. Winning would be celebrated, and the winner would be expected to buy the next round of ale. Physical contests would include stone lifting, where men would compete to lift progressively heavier rocks, demonstrating their strength. Jumping contests would challenge agility and power. Archery contests would test skill with bow and arrow. These competitions would be partly entertainment and partly practice for practical skills needed in warfare and hunting. Swimming would be a recreational activity in summer, though the water would be cold even in good weather. Young people especially would jump into rivers or the sea, daring each other to swim farther or dive deeper. It would be genuinely dangerous, with drowning being a real risk, but it would also be exhilarating and fun. The cold water would be shocking and refreshing after hot work in the fields. Ice skating would happen in winter, using bone skates. Smooth pieces of bone strapped to your boots that let you glide across frozen surfaces. It would be practical for travel across frozen lakes and rivers, but also fun, racing with others or just enjoying the sensation of speed. Falls would be frequent and painful, landing hard on ice, but you'd get back up and keep going. Festivals would mark the seasons and important events, providing occasions for the whole community to gather. These would involve feasting, drinking, games, and socializing on a larger scale than everyday life. Everyone would dress in their best clothes, such as they are, and participate in the communal celebrations. The work of daily life would pause for a day or two, a welcome break that everyone looks forward to. Crafting would be both work and leisure. In the evening, you might carve a decoration into a wooden cup you're making, not because it needs decoration, but because you enjoy the creative process. Or you might work on a piece of jewellery, bending wire into patterns or polishing a stone. The line between practical work and artistic expression would be blurred, with everyday objects being opportunities for beauty. Riddles would be a form of verbal entertainment, with people posing clever questions and others trying to solve them. The riddles would range from straightforward to deliberately obscure, and solving a difficult riddle would bring praise. Creating new riddles would be a creative challenge, trying to describe something in a way that's accurate but not obvious. Gossip would be a major form of entertainment, though it wouldn't be called that. Sharing news about who's courting whom, who had an argument, whose crops are doing well, who's planning a voyage, all of this would be discussed at length. The stories would be embellished in the telling, with everyone adding their own interpretations and opinions. You'd be simultaneously entertained by others' dramas, and aware that your own life is probably being discussed similarly elsewhere. Watching craftspeople work would be entertainment for those not currently occupied. Seeing the blacksmith shape hot metal, watching the shipwright fit planks together, observing someone skilled at carving or weaving, all of this would be interesting. You'd learn by watching, picking up techniques and understanding, while also appreciating the skill involved. Play fighting among friends would happen frequently, practicing combat skills in a less serious context. You'd wrestle, exchange blows with wooden practice weapons, and test each other's reflexes. It would hurt sometimes, bruises would be common, but it would also be fun and build camaraderie. The skill gained from this play would be useful if real combat ever becomes necessary. Long conversations would be their own form of entertainment. Sitting around the fire in the evening, people would discuss philosophy in their own way, debating what makes a good person, what the gods want, what happens after death, whether it's better to be rich or respected. These conversations would circle back on themselves, reaching no conclusions but providing mental stimulation. Practical jokes would be played, some funny and some crossing the line into mean. Someone might replace salt with ash, or hide someone's favourite cup, or spread a rumour that turns out to be false. The target would be expected to take it in good humour, but tensions would sometimes flare when jokes go too far. Revenge pranks would follow, creating ongoing cycles of trickery. Let's wrap up with the reality check that would hit hardest: the complete lack of comfort, convenience, and safety that modern life provides without you even noticing. Every single aspect of daily life would be harder, more painful, more uncertain, and more exhausting than anything most modern people experience. The cumulative effect of all these difficulties would wear you down in ways that are hard to imagine. Your body would hurt constantly in multiple places simultaneously. Your back would ache from physical labor and poor sleeping arrangements. Your joints would be stiff and sore. Your hands would be covered in calluses, cuts, and developing arthritis from repetitive motions. Your feet would be tough, but also damaged from inadequate footwear and constant walking. Finding a position where nothing hurts would be impossible, so you just learn to function through the pain. Exhaustion would be your baseline state. You'd wake up tired, work all day while tired, and go to bed still tired. True rest where you feel genuinely refreshed would be rare, maybe happening a few times a year when circumstances align to give you proper recovery time. You'd forget what it feels like to have energy to spare, to do things just because you want to rather than because they need doing. The lack of medical care would mean you'd watch minor problems become major ones with no ability to stop the progression. That persistent cough would just have to run its course. The tooth that hurts would hurt until it falls out or gets pulled. The joint that's developing arthritis would just get worse over time. You'd adjust your activities around your limitations and hope nothing gets bad enough to be disabling. Food security would be a constant background worry. Every harvest would bring anxiety about whether there'll be enough to last until next year. A bad harvest would mean genuine hunger, not just missing meals, but actual malnutrition affecting your health and strength. You'd go to bed hungry sometimes, and there'd be nothing to do about it except hope tomorrow brings something better. The cold would be inescapable in winter. You'd be cold inside, cold outside, cold day and night. Your fingers and toes would hurt from the cold. Your face would be chapped and raw, and you'd never quite warm up all the way through. You'd dream of warmth the way a starving person dreams of food, imagining what it would feel like to be truly, deeply warm. Illness would sweep through the longhouse periodically, with everyone getting sick in turn, because there's no way to isolate when you're all living in one room. You'd nurse sick family members while trying not to get sick yourself, inevitably failing, and then being sick while still trying to keep up with necessary work. The sick would recover or they wouldn't, and you'd have limited ability to influence which outcome occurs. The lack of privacy would be mentally exhausting. You'd never be truly alone, never have a moment where you don't need to be aware of others and how you're perceived. Your thoughts would be the only private thing you possess, and even those might be subject to scrutiny if you express them aloud. The pressure to conform to social expectations would be constant and inescapable. Personal hygiene would be a losing battle you'd eventually stop fighting so hard. You'd accept that you smell, your clothes are dirty, your hair is greasy, and your teeth are deteriorating. Everyone else is in the same situation, so the standards would be low. You'd do what you can when you can, but you'd never feel truly clean the way a modern shower makes you feel. The monotony would be soul-crushing at times. The same work, the same food, the same people, the same longhouse day after day after day. Variety would come from seasonal changes and occasional travels or visitors, but mostly life would be repetitive in ways that make you understand why storytelling and festivals are so important. They'd be the bright spots that make the monotony bearable. Danger would be omnipresent, but not dramatic. You wouldn't be fighting off attackers daily, but you'd be surrounded by things that could kill or injure you. Tools, animals, weather, disease, the sea, fire, other people. You'd need to be constantly careful, and even so, accidents would happen. The knowledge that your life could change in an instant from bad luck or a moment's carelessness would create low-level stress that never fully goes away. Your expectations would adjust over time. What seems unbearable at first would become normal. You'd find satisfaction in completing tasks, pleasure in small comforts, joy in community bonds. You'd develop resilience and toughness that modern life doesn't require. But you'd also be worn down, aged beyond your years, marked by the hardness of this life in ways both visible and invisible. Looking at your hands would tell the story. Scarred, calloused, stained, misshapen from injuries and repetitive work. These wouldn't be hands that type on keyboards or scroll through phones. These would be hands that have worked every day for years, that have handled fish and tools and animals and wool and 1,000 other things. You'd be proud of what these hands have accomplished while also being acutely aware of what they've cost you. Your reflection in still water would show someone older than their years. Your skin would be weathered and lined from sun and wind. Your teeth would be worn and discolored. Your hair would be rough and streaked with grey earlier than genetics alone would dictate. Your body would be lean and strong but also damaged, moving with the care of someone who knows where the pain is and how to minimize it. Sleep would be your escape, the only time your body isn't demanding something from you. Even with the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, You'd be so tired that you'd fall asleep quickly and deeply. Dreams might offer brief respites where you're not cold, not hungry, not hurting, not worried. Then you'd wake up and it all starts again. The community bonds would be the main thing making it bearable. You'd be surrounded by people who understand because they're going through the same struggles. You'd help each other, share resources, provide emotional support, celebrate together, and grieve together. The connections would be deep and meaningful because you genuinely need each other. No one could survive alone in these conditions. You'd develop a different perspective on what matters. Status symbols would be practical: a good knife, solid boots, a warm cloak. Wealth would mean food stored for winter and animals that produce more food. Success would be measured by whether your household thrives, whether your children grow strong, whether your reputation is good. The concerns that dominate modern life would seem absurd if you could even understand them. Looking back on modern conveniences would be painful if you could remember them. The ability to be warm whenever you want, to eat varied food from around the world, to communicate instantly across distances, to travel quickly, to be clean and comfortable and safe. All of this would seem like impossible luxury. You'd realize how much you took for granted, how many problems have been solved that you never thought about. But you'd also find satisfactions that modern life doesn't provide. The direct connection between your work and your survival would give meaning to every task. The deep knowledge of your local environment would connect you to the land. The strong community bonds would provide belonging that transcends the superficial. The stars would be brilliant in the unpolluted sky, and you'd know them like old friends because you use them for navigation. Ultimately, you wouldn't last as a Viking because the gap between modern life and Viking age life is too vast. The physical demands alone would be more than most modern people could handle, and that's before considering the social challenges, the lack of medical care, the food insecurity, and the 100 other difficulties we've discussed. You'd be overwhelmed within days, injured within weeks, and probably wouldn't survive your first winter.